Good afternoon. I'm in the UK, so it's afternoon for me, but it might be morning time for you, to everybody that's joined us today on our webinar. We've got a really exciting webinar today. It's going to be about biometrics, privacy and exclusion. And I've got two amazing panelists with me today. I've got Dr. Keren Weitzberg and also Debbie Reynolds. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves later on. First of all, just going to do a little bit of housekeeping about the webinar today. Welcome to everybody. I think we've got actually a lot of people registered for today's webinar. So that shows that, and I think everything that we've seen in the press over the last number of weeks has really put a good eye on what the topics that we're going to talk today. And I've got some amazing people with me to talk about those with you. So just housekeeping, everybody will be on mute. So if you have got a question that you want to ask today, we've got the Zoom webinar chat that you can pop your question in. And also you can raise your hand to ask a question as well. We've got our amazing technical support from Women in Identity, which is Caitlin. She's going to be in the background making sure that everything works properly. But if you are going to speak, or if you're putting something into the chat box, if you can just identify yourself so that we can introduce you to you, or people know where the context of the question's coming from. And obviously our panelists know the context of the question that's coming through. All our webinars are recorded for members who can't attend, and they're going to be available on our YouTube channel. If you have got any feedback or anything that you want to give after the event, there is an email address that you can email to, which is events@womeninidentity.org. And at the end of this, we're going to have a feedback survey because it's really vital that we get the feedback that we're actually hitting the right topics that our members want to hear about. Thanks very much. Next slide. So, tell you a little bit about Women in Identity. Some of you that will be attending this webinar will be our members. Some of you will be very familiar with the work that we do. We've actually been formally organised for a year. It's just coming up to our year's birthday, but we've been less formally organised for about 2 years. But we are a not-for-profit led organisation, and we are run entirely by volunteers. So everything that you see that's happening today is all run by our amazing volunteers. I want to thank all of our volunteers that we have across the world. I'm very proud to be working with our volunteers. We have 1,100 members across the world, which is really amazing. It's growing all of the time, our membership base. I'm always really impressed in how many members that we get coming in from all different regions across the world. And we have 18 ambassadors, and you can see that our ambassadors here that sit within different regions, because what we understand about identity is that identity is very cultural. And so what we do at Women in Identity is make sure that our organization is not just growing out from, perhaps, a single Western country or a group of Western countries, but that we have our ambassadors in these regions really helping us understand what the Women in Identity group needs to be and what our mission and vision needs to be. And we have 4,500 followers on our social media, and that's growing all the time as well. Next slide. So, Women in Identity, we often get asked this question, well, Women in Identity, it must all just be about women. And actually, it's really not. If we look at the identity industry, the industry is hugely underrepresented across gender, across race, across ability, across ethnicity, sexual identity, creed, age, or social status. And when we think about the systems that we're building with an identity systems are, if we believe it, they are the gatekeeper to financial services, they are the gatekeeper to healthcare, they are the gatekeeper to a whole host of different things that people want to access, particularly online. And therefore, our systems really need to be empathetic to those users and need to work for the needs of everybody. And when we look at our industry it certainly does not represent the people that we are building systems for. And that's a concern. And that's that is absolutely, from our mission, Women in Identity, We are a female-run organization, but we are ambassadors and really driving for change within this industry to ensure that we are building systems as an industry that are empathetic and are built for all users. And we want to inspire, elevate and support a more diverse workforce within the identity industry. And that is absolutely critical to ensure that the systems that work for everybody and are built for everybody and could be potentially built by everybody. Next slide. So as I said there, that's our vision. We want to have identity solutions intended for everyone, to be designed and built by everybody. And we do that for a number of things. We have, obviously meetups and events like this. Obviously we've moved to online events. We do it through thought leadership, where often you'll see us speaking at lots of events. We do that through research. We're looking to start doing some research later on this year. But really to take particularly people that are doing amazing work within the industry and perhaps don't have a voice within our industry, and really support those voices and to elevate them to ensure that they can be heard. Next slide. So we are going to have a series of webinars. So this is the second in our series of webinars. We are going to have a number of these running, and we really would welcome your feedback. And all I can say to you is just join the webinars. If you don't manage to join them, obviously we've got our YouTube channel, so you can listen to them later. And obviously the YouTube channel can also be shared as well. So if you are lucky enough to be on one of our webinars and listen live, and you think that this content is important to people in your organization, please feel free to share the content. We would love to get our message out further to people that are working with our industry. But you can see a number of the topics there. The ethics of AI, and that's going to be super interesting. Managing a remote workforce, personal branding in COVID-19. So what we try to do as an organization is have a mix of both identity, privacy, security related topics, but also combine those with personal development topics as well for our members and also our allies that are working with us in the industry. This is our webinar series from May to August 2020, but we will be taking our webinar series forward and past that. Next slide. If you want to follow us, we are our amazing social media team, our volunteer social media team are prolific across Twitter and also LinkedIn. These are our hashtags, so please follow our hashtags. But yeah, predominantly we're on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. Next slide. And if you want to join us, it is free to join Women in Identity, and that was a very conscious decision to make it completely free to join Women in Identity, because we want to be as inclusive of anybody. You don't just have to be a woman to join. We have lots of male ally members as well. So please join. Go to www.womeninidentity.org to become a member, and you'll get an email and you'll be able to join. You'll get access to our newsletter. And also updates that we send out as well. And I also want to thank our sponsors. So we have a number of sponsors that actually allow us to pay for the operations. So, making sure that we can pay for a Zoom license and things like that. So I want to say a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who really support this mission and vision that we have, that identity systems should be built for everyone, by everyone. Next slide. So that takes us to our webinar of today. So my name is Emma Lindley. I realized I didn't introduce myself at the start. So my name is Emma Lindley. I am one of the co-founders of Women in Identity. I am also managing director of a company called AiiD. And I am going to ask Debbie to introduce herself, and then we'll go to Keren. And if you could just introduce yourself and just give a bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Debbie Reynolds. I'm the CEO, founder, and Chief Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. I'm also the Data Privacy Officer for Women in Identity. So thank you guys for having me. I work with companies, multinational companies all over the world that have multinational data privacy challenges and operations. So there may be barriers to adoption and entry into new markets, being able to work with investor groups, or just working with companies that are trying to either start, mature, or change, or even pivot into different realms of privacy to grow their businesses.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, Debbie and Keren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Keren Weitzberg. I'm a researcher based at University College London. I'm actually a historian by training, but my methods are very anthropological in nature. I do a lot of field work and interviewing, and most of my work is centered on East Africa. I've been going to East Africa for well over a decade. I was actually meant to be leaving today for a 5-month research trip, which has sadly been postponed due to the pandemic, but I'm excited to be here with you today. And I focus really on issues related to digital identity, identification more broadly, and biometrics, and especially as they relate to people at the political and economic margins, including refugees and migrants.
Great, thanks, Keren. So we don't, just to remind everyone, we don't have any slides for today. This is quite an interactive session. So we like to run our sessions as audience participation. So there is going to be a few polls during our session today. So I will let you know when you should be putting an answer into our polls, and then we can kind of take that feedback and we can discuss it. I'm also really interested if anyone from the audience has any questions. We're going to have some sections throughout where we will be asking the audience for questions as well. So I'll let you know when that happens. So just in terms of the topic today, I think biometric registration and programs have raised, many concerns related to surveillance and privacy. And I think, we were kind of talking about this week and we were saying, where should we kind of start the webinar in terms of the discussion? And actually, we didn't necessarily need to have that discussion because there's been a number of things in the press this week that have come out that I think really should form the basis for our discussion. So there's a couple of news announcements, and we're gonna use those as our thread to kind of form our discussion. So the first kind of group of announcements are really around IBM withdrawing from the facial recognition market. So IBM's CEO told Congress on Monday, so I'm reading this from the article, that the tech firm will no longer offer, develop, research facial recognition technology as it strongly opposes the technology's use for mass surveillance, racial profiling, violations of human rights and freedom. So then closely by follow suit, we had an announcement from Amazon. So Amazon has said it's pausing its police use of facial recognition for a year. And then Microsoft also came out through on the back of that, and they kind of reaffirmed their statement that they don't sell their technology to the police. So that's kind of like the first point that the stepping off point that I want to talk about. And then the second piece of news we're going to talk about is the new biometric standard that NIST are talking about. But we'll talk about that later on in the session. So the first question that I want to actually, this is going to be a poll for the audience. First question is about IBM and Amazon. So for the audience, I think we're really interested to know, do you think that IBM / Amazon withdrawing from the market is a good or a bad thing? So if you can just, in the audience participation, if you can just pop in there and say the IBM, whether it's withdrawing from the market, is a good or bad thing. Just check that everyone can vote in there. Caitlin, you let me know when we've got some votes coming in.
Yep, we've got votes coming in right now. We've got about 65% saying good and 35% saying bad. Okay,
that's interesting. So, audience is saying that it's a predominantly they think that it's a good thing. So that's really interesting feedback. So thank you to everybody that's just that has just voted on that. So before I go to Debbie and Keren and get their viewpoint on this, I think it's really important just to kind of talk a little bit about biometrics and facial recognition, and because I think that those terms actually are used interchangeably. Just like the interestingly, the identity market, we use lots of terms interchangeably, which is very, very confusing for everybody, both inside and outside of the market. But particularly, facial recognition and biometrics, those terms are used interchangeably, but they're similar, but there are some key differences potentially. So again, this is for us to have some discussion. In terms of technology, when we think about facial recognition, potentially we think around, surveillance, cameras perhaps that are being used without user consent. And then that might be different to perhaps logging into your bank using a biometric, for example, which could be done with consent. So I want to go to Debbie first of all. So how do you think about the differences between facial recognition and biometrics? You've obviously got an amazing legal background and privacy background. What's your view?
Oh, thank you, Emma. Well, I feel like, to me, I'm not really separating facial recognition from the other biometrics, because all of these things are very personal to ourselves, and because they are being entered into different types of identity systems, I think that we all need to sort of look at them all together, because you never know. So, a lot of us have phones where it asks us for our thumbprint or face ID, or, you may do some type of banking where it's asking for that information. So I feel like a lot of this stuff is sort of in a bigger barrel, and so to speak, especially depending on how companies want to use it and how they're going to be able to get consent from people to use those technologies. And obviously people are very concerned about their information being used without their consent in other forms.
Okay, and Keren, have you got a viewpoint on that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about biometrics, we're really talking about a whole spectrum of technologies that can be put to all sorts of different uses. Obviously, I think using unlocking your phone with facial recognition technology is very different from, say, the police relying on a large centralized database of facial images and engaging in a kind of mass surveillance without people's consent. And so it's very important that we distinguish between these things. But I think, as privacy advocates have also pointed out, there's always a danger of function creep. And I think we always have to be careful when we're talking about such sensitive data.
Okay, so I've actually got a comment from somebody in the chat. So Adam Ross has said, it's not necessarily about them exiting the market, it's more of a statement against the use of facial recognition against unwarranted mass surveillance by the police. So I read the the IBM statement about them. They have actually said that they are not going to develop their technology anymore. They also, I think, said that they weren't making any money as well. So, those kind of two things, when you see them in a statement, you could go, okay, were they exiting the market because they weren't making money out of it, or, what's the kind of viewpoint? So I don't know if Debbie, have you got a view on that at all?
Actually, I do. So at first when I heard it, I thought, oh, okay, great. IBM's, really stepping up to the plate. Once I look at it a little bit more deeply, I don't know, I'm not trying to be a cynic about the whole thing, but, in my view, facial recognition is going nowhere. So it's going to be around. It's not like it's going to disappear off the earth. So what I'm looking to companies to do is really improve the technology. So, we know that bias exists in these systems, and we've known it for many years. So what I really like to see, instead of people saying they're going to stop using it or stop developing it, is, what are you going to do to improve it? Because it is going to be out regardless.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting viewpoint. And also, if some of the big players decide they want to exit the market, who is then going to lead? To your point, if it's going to carry, this technology is going to carry on being developed, who will then lead the market? Will they have the same kind of governance structure as perhaps an IBM, for example? Keren, I don't know if you've got any comments that you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, I would say I probably fall into the slightly more cynical camp. And I think, like Debbie, I initially saw this as a positive development. And I think in many ways it's actually testament more to the power of, the Black Lives Matter protests, various, I think, civil society and privacy rights groups like the Algorithmic Justice League that have been pointing towards the inbuilt biases within a lot of facial recognition technology. And I think this is really the fact that companies are responding, I think, is testament to really the power of those movements. But I also think, yeah, IBM, firstly, I think is not one of the main providers of these technologies to US police departments. And also they do provide other kinds of smart technologies to the police. So I find this to be a somewhat disingenuous position.
Okay, that's interesting. And we've actually got some comments coming in from the from some of the audience as well. So we've got somebody saying, I agree with Debbie, it's a bad decision for IBM as they're withdrawing a chance to influence the strategic direction of this space for the better. So that's, you know, interesting there. And then Shelley Bryan's also said, I agree to Keren's point to ensure there's a difference between use cases, identity verification, onboarding versus mass surveillance. So yeah, and then we've got somebody else saying, yeah, facial recognition is definitely, you know, not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. It's still going to be, you know, it's still going to be in the marketplace. So Debbie, I think you just touched on there, the IBM CEO talked about, you know, he talked about the bias in the products and how that can increase inequality. And that's something that, you know, we at Women in Identity talk about all the time, you know, because there are examples that we can see. And, you know, and I think it's one of those things that I've had lots of debates with people about, because, you know, people have come to me and gone, oh, well, that, you know, that headline about, you know, it creating inequality, that's just a, you know, it's a headline. It's not actually, it's not something that's happening. So how much would you say that you think this is actually a real issue? I have my own viewpoint. I'm kind of interested in what you think.
Well, it's a huge issue, you know, especially me being a woman of color, having people surveil me or someone who looks like me incorrectly could be a life or death decision for me. So it's a huge problem.
Yeah, and then and Keren, have you got a viewpoint? Because obviously you've done lots of work in, you know, a number of countries in Africa. What's your kind of view in terms of bias being potentially built into some of these products and how that might affect populations?
Facial recognition isn't used very widely in African countries, with some exceptions, but I share Debbie's reservations. I think that obviously I think facial recognition technologies pose risks when they both do work well and when they don't work well. And I tend to agree that I tend to think that these technologies are being rushed out far ahead of policy and far ahead of regulation. And I would like to see, if not a full scale, and you're welcome to disagree with me, moratorium on these, but really a massive rolling back of some of these technologies. I actually think there's been some really positive signs and evidence that there's a growing public conversation around this issue, which I think is really positive.
Yeah, I mean, certainly hitting the headlines. Go on, Debbie.
I'm sorry, just one more point I want to make, just to pull it back to identity systems. You know, a lot of these private companies, they're accustomed to building systems for a very narrow spectrum of people, you know, who are their customer base. But in identity, we have to be able to build systems that work for everybody. So trying to shoehorn something that was intended for a smaller audience and try to apply it more globally, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, kind of what's the impetus behind the industry to make sure that the systems work for everybody, you know, and I think that's a really interesting point. So I think what I was going to do is actually open this up now to the audience to see if anybody wants to kind of raise their hand and ask a question. I think we've got some questions in the Q&A section. So I'm just going to flip to some of those questions. Okay, so I've got a question here, just whizzing through the questions. So do the panelists agree there are legitimate uses for biometrics, including facial recognition? Is law enforcement a use of facial recognition always bad in the panel's view? It's quite a thorny question, but
that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I would say it's, I'm in favor of technology, period, but it has to be applied the right way. So I guess I'm not in favor of people uh, delegating their decision making to computers. So I think, humans should be the ultimate decider, not the technology.
Okay, Keren, have you got a view on that at all? Just while I read the next question.
It's a very, very tricky issue. I unfortunately have seen some of these technologies being used, particularly I would say in Israel, Palestine, in ways that make me very uncomfortable. So I've seen use cases that make me very wary of the ways in which these technologies are deployed. But that being said, I would say that were there to be a lot more transparency around how these technologies are being used, much more regulation, I don't feel comfortable saying that. I think I somewhat agree with Debbie that these technologies are going to exist. And surely there can be some positive uses of them in law enforcement, but in reality, I haven't seen a lot of examples of those.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting book. It's actually written by somebody from Microsoft called Tools and Weapons. And I think if you kind of look at this as being one of those examples where you go, actually, it could be a really amazing tool, but actually, it could be a weapon as well. And I think really as an industry, we have to really consciously think through those things and how they could be misused and what the unintended consequences could be. Okay, cool. I'm just having a look for some of the questions. Okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll move to the next section, because I think we've got quite a few questions and we've covered the IBM topic. So the next thing I want to talk about, because we just touched on, some of the issues around bias. So NIST, again, this was in the news this week. NIST came out with a new standard that they're talking about. So I'll just read this from the press release, and this was in Biometrics update. So the new standard will give planners, implementers, and systems operators of biometric applications an overview of which aspects they need to consider so that their applications meet consumer requirements. This is very important because consumers' issues with biometric applications might be quite complex and diverse as the consumers themselves. It's interesting because that's obviously the women in identity mantra. So, as diverse as the consumers themselves. So, so I think, I don't know if anyone else has kind of seen this this update from NIST and that came through Biometrics update. I've got an audience question again and I think we've just touched on it a little bit just in the previous section around standards. So I'm going to do another poll to the audience, and the poll to the audience is: do you think we need to see more or less standards in the biometrics space? So you've got to everybody that's attending, we've got another poll in there. Would you like to see more or less standards in the biometric space? And Caitlin, if you can just let us know when we're getting a number of people
we're getting some answers roll in, and it is a overwhelming more right now.
Okay.
About 95%.
Okay, right, more standards. Everybody wants more standards. Okay, cool. So that's really interesting that people are, they're agreeing with, I think what you were saying is around, obviously standards, we've got policy and things that we've talked about. We need to have more standards in the space. So my first question, I think, is for you, Keren. You've had lots of experience working with biometric systems in some of the countries in Africa. How important do you think, and particularly with this standard, this new NIST standard, in terms of understanding users' needs and the people that these systems might be working for, how important do you think that it's understanding users' requirements are, and how did you go about doing that on some of the projects that you worked on?
Yeah, so I would say there's a lot of talk about providing financial services to the unbanked in African countries and providing digital identity to people who are either undocumented or underdocumented. Unfortunately, I think what I've seen on the ground is that a lot of intergovernmental organizations, governments, companies do have often a very flattened view of the African user and often don't recognize that there's huge variations across African countries. I see a lot of cut and paste models being applied across different African countries and actually across the global South. To give a few examples of this, so I've studied mobile credit lending in Kenya. Kenya, in part because like most African countries, they have mandatory SIM registration, and because they also have a very robust mobile money service known as M-Pesa. In recent years, what we've seen is a number of credit lending institutions, banks have been providing Kenyans, who many of whom are locked out of formal banking, with access to microloans via their mobile phones. And this has been a service that a lot of Kenyans have embraced. But I think the model of the user that a lot of companies had in mind was the kind of small business owner. And in reality, a lot of people were using these microloans really for just daily consumption. And there were a lot of, I think, problems that arose as a result of this service being rolled out very quickly. One of them has to do with identity theft. It's actually relatively easy for people to take someone's ID and register another SIM card in their name, or to take someone's phone and download an app and then all of a sudden take out money in their name. People were also finding themselves listed as defaulters on credit reference bureaus, which were institutions that many Kenyans weren't even aware existed. And I can go on about this. There were a lot of, I think just not a lot of transparency in the way users weren't always aware of the implications of taking out these microcredit loans, or even the ways in which their mobile phone data might be shared or used. So I would like to see a lot more recognition and just a lot more awareness of that African users are, embedded in these broader systems, broader ecosystems, and just a broader awareness of them. And also, I think the diversity, the spectrum of users across different African countries.
Yeah, and such a huge range. You kind of sometimes hear people talking about Africa as it's like one country, and I'm kind of like, well, it's 50 plus countries, and they're all very different. It's like people saying Europe's just one country, which obviously it isn't either. So, incredibly diverse and different user needs in each one of those markets. And so I think you just touched on around consent. Just in terms of like thinking about, biometrics and consent within those markets. And then I'm going to kind of move to Debbie, because I think this is something that, within the privacy spectrum as well, like how do people think about consent? Because I think even in, if we look at what's happening in Europe with things like PSD2 and secure customer authentication, all of the banks are starting to think about biometrics now. And so how do we think about, users' needs and users' understanding and consent within all of that kind of model? What was your experience when you're working with some of these people in some of these African countries? Keren, sorry.
I would say that there's also a big issue with consent as well. And I really think that consent is something that has to be built from the ground up. So one thing that I've been looking very closely at is Kenya's new biometric registration project, which is known as Huduma number, or service number in Swahili. And it's very much modeled after India's Aadhaar system. There's some notable differences, but the Kenyan government has rolled out this biometric registration program. It has yet to fully implement it. It's meant to give a unique identifier to each Kenyan. But there's been a lot of controversy that was generated around the rollout of Huduma number. And there was actually even a court case. A number of civil society groups went before the Kenyan High Court and challenged the constitutionality of this. And one of the things the court case did was to require the Kenyan government to, they said that the registration process could go forward, but it couldn't be mandatory. In reality, what I think often happened on the ground is a lot of Kenyans felt pressured into registering. They did so because of contradictory statements from the Kenyan government. So at one point, a Kenyan government official even said that SIM cards would be turned off if people didn't register for Huduma number. And by the way, something very similar happened recently in Tanzania. So this wasn't necessarily an empty threat. And so even though the process was meant to technically be a voluntary process where you could or could not register for a Huduma number, in reality, I think a lot of people felt coerced, sometimes coerced by local chiefs, sometimes by employers, just generally were very confused about these contradictory statements coming from government officials. So, and I've seen this, unfortunately, time and time again. I also see this, I do research into refugee registration with the UNHCR, and I think that a lot of refugees often feel pressured into having their biometrics taken and registering, don't really feel like they have the option of opting out because registration, you know, aid and services are contingent on registration. So I would like to see a lot more attention being paid to consent, and to consent really being, as I said, built from the bottom up.
Okay, from the user up. And Debbie, have you got a view on the, you know, from a legal perspective, what's your kind of view in terms of consent and people's understanding?
You know, consent is a huge issue all over the world, especially because these systems, well, let me back up. Let's not pretend like companies don't want this data for other purposes beyond what it's used for or what they say they want it for. So being able to have a system in place where people understand all these other uses that are intended, and also having the power to be able to say yes or no is very different. So, you know, the EU, because you all have the GDPR, you have a standard for that in terms of onward transfer, but we don't have that in a lot of places in the US and other countries. So, you know, it's kind of a free-for-all for all this data. So it's sort of, it is scary because you give your data for one purpose and it may be used for something else. And then you think about communities that don't have the right to redress or the ability to fight back and be able to get either get their data back or be able to raise their hand if they have an issue. I mean, it's a big problem that has to be resolved.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to whip to the Q&A. Okay, all right. I've got a question here. So in some of the examples that Keren gave, it seems that there's a reliance on device intelligence and not biometric identification. If that's correct, we don't know whether it is or not. So just respond to that first. And then how could biometrics help in this case? And what are the problematic biases that you saw in your work, Keren?
Yeah, I assume this is referring to the mobile lending
It
case.
doesn't say it in there, but yeah, let's just assume.
Yeah. Well, it's true that when it comes to mobile lending, it's really a matter of people just downloading an app on their phone. Where biometric registration comes into the picture is that Kenyans need to provide their fingerprints in order to get a national ID. And you have to use either a national ID or passport to register a SIM card. And if you don't register your SIM card, that's mandatory in Kenya, essentially. So I would say there are biometrics involved, but not necessarily at the point in which the user is downloading an app in order to access a microloan. So I think what the Kenyan government is arguing is that this new digital biometric registration program known as Huduma number, that once it's actually implemented, that this is going to help dramatically with issues of identity fraud. Whether or not that actually will happen, I think remains to be seen. But I think there is an effort right now on the part of the Kenyan government to update its current system in order to remedy some of these problems.
Okay, that's interesting. Right, let me just try and find another question in here. Okay, so somebody else has asked a question here. So Christine's asked a question. If a person, a refugee, doesn't consent to having their biometrics registered to gain access to services, what other options out there to reasonably gauge someone's identity and provide them with services?
That is a great question. I have never, ever encountered a refugee who has opted out. I'm not saying they don't exist, and the UNHCR, I'm sure, I know will say that if a refugee has a legitimate reason to opt out, they can, but I don't know of an example of that happening.
Okay, that's interesting. Right, I'm just going to whip through some more of these questions. Okay, so just going back to the biometric standards. So Adam's put into the chat, do we really need more biometric standards on how biometric systems are developed and implemented? Or do we need more conventions or treaties that govern and especially restrict their use? Debbie, what do you think to that one?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not opposed to standards ever, but to me, so there's a difference in my opinion between obviously standards we need, laws we need, the technology and what it does, but none of those things can really address ethics. I mean, I think we assume or we hope that they will, but that's not necessarily the case. So the issue is, you know, even if you can do it, and this is something that Emma and I were talking about yesterday, should you do it? Should you even be doing it in the first place? Or, you know, are the laws we're making, are they making things more fair, or are they making things more just? Or are the standards, is it just lip service? Are people really following the standards? And if they do follow the standards, does that mean that they're doing things like taking bias out of the systems, or are they opening up these systems to more people and thinking through, you know, the least capable or least able user? Let's say your grandmother who's 80, you know, could your grandmother go through these identity systems? Like, these are the types of questions that these makers really need to be thinking about when they're developing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And you know, I think a lot of if I think about a lot of the standards bodies that kind of exist within the identity ecosystem, they are very technical standards bodies. And that there's not necessarily, you know, these aren't necessarily all technical questions that we're asking. And well, they're not all technical questions that we're asking. And so I sometimes wonder whether, you know, I kind of go, well, actually, yeah, we've got a technical standard, but does that address all of the concerns? Can you codify ethics, for example, you know, question mark. And I think the technical standards deal with, you know, whether a technology can remove bias, but then we might go, well, should it still be used within that particular context? And obviously what we've seen from, you know, IBM saying, well, actually, we're going to withdraw out of the market, and we're going to not continue developing in that respect. So I don't know whether, you know, I think about standards and go, well, where the identity standards, you know, are being developed today, it's very technology orientated, and should there be another set of standards that actually deals with things like ethics, and we've got some privacy standards, but if you're working in a market or in a use case where there are no privacy standards, what then happens? You know, there's kind of a bit of a vacuum there, isn't there? Yeah. And so you're left with perhaps, you know, an organization that wants to supply services into that market, and they're saying, well, should I or shouldn't I? And that's an ethical decision for that organization, but it doesn't have that framework around it. Right, okay. If anyone else has got any more questions from the audience, we are definitely open to questions. Right, okay. I'm just trying to find some more questions in here. Okay, all right. So this is a comment from I think Debbie, you know, is it David?
David.
So David said, yeah. So he said there's a need for a set of biometric standards based on forensics, and that's become a real aspect. And this is due to the market being flooded by companies with zero knowledge of identity. So I don't know if anyone's got a view on that. That's quite a it's a contentious kind of question, but has anyone got a view on, you know, the fact that we've got companies coming into the market that perhaps might not understand it, and therefore that has a set of challenges as well? I don't know if either of you have got a view.
I think it's true. I mean, if you think of, you know, the fact that everyone on the planet should be able to be your customer is a huge problem. So, because you have private industries that are focused on a particular customer, where in identity you have to think about all customers. So it's sort of a mismatch in my view, of being able to try to find a way that technology can really reach everyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I've got a question from somebody here called Christine, who she's a UX researcher in identity. So a super interesting question here. So when thinking about how we provide identity to the 1 billion undocumented people, most companies' go-to responses are to use biometrics. How can we ensure true informed consent when using biometrics among this population where low digital literacy is also common? So I'll go to Keren first on that one. What's your view?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and there's no easy answer, but I think part of that is including civil society groups and really including people in the process as much as possible. I also think it's recognizing that there is never going to be a system that doesn't have flaws and that isn't going to have some kind of problem of exclusion, and building avenues of redress when when problems do arise. As far as consent, I really think that it's very tricky when you have massive power imbalances. So the case of refugees is a particularly profound instance in which you have very vulnerable people who are often in need of services who don't really feel like they could opt out, even if they technically can. And you also have, in many cases, instances of minors being registered. So even if it's with the consent of adults, there are people who end up in the refugee system who enter the refugee system as minors. And I think as much as possible, we need to listen to advocates and organizations on the ground, because there are quite a few, I've spoken to a lot of civil society organizations in Kenya. I've worked closely with them, who are trying to address these issues and trying to talk about the problems of exclusion within identity and digital identity systems, issues around consent. And I think just as much as possible, working closely with these groups and amplifying their voices as much as possible, because they're often the ones who are really stepping in when there's a gap. I'll give an example of a group called Haki Sharia in Northern Kenya, who have really stepped up to help people who are essentially stuck in legal limbo because they're Kenyan citizens who can't access national IDs because their biometrics are in the refugee system. And Haki Sharia has been working very hard to advocate on behalf of this group of people, which numbers probably in the tens of thousands. And I think as much as possible, if we can work closely with these kinds of groups that might also just be aware of problems that policymakers just aren't even cognizant of, I think that's really key.
I think that's really interesting. It's all about the execution on the ground, isn't it? And really understanding what users are saying on the ground. And it's interesting because that's kind of what this NIST standard sounds like it's alluding to, is really we need to start thinking about users and consumers that are going to be actually using these products. How that becomes a pure technical standard ? But that remains to be seen. And I think Debbie, when we think about consent and digital literacy, when I think about the stats in the UK, and the stats are probably very similar in the US. If we look at the UK, 11% of people in the UK can't actually turn on a device. So the digital literacy doesn't necessarily mean, that people in, somewhere like Kenya or another, perhaps emerging market, what's your view on consent and something like biometrics in terms of you know, somewhere like the US, where we still have, you know, quite large proportions of people that have, you know, are not digitally literate, and how do we get them, you know, understanding what they're actually doing in terms of the systems that they're using?
Great question. Well, I'll start with more of some global statistics. Okay, so only about 45% of people in the world have smartphones, and a lot of things like these contact tracing apps are on smartphones, so they're ignoring the majority of people who do not have access to those systems. And then also only about 57% of people in the world have internet access. And then you add on top of that, people who do have smartphones or do have internet access may not know how to even access those systems. You know, like, to go back to the grandma example, grandma has a smartphone and she has internet access, but she may not know how to navigate to get access to these services. And we even have people, you know, the digital divide issue is really big, especially, you know, in communities like, because of the pandemic, a lot of kids had to work from home or do school from home. If they didn't have a computer at home, then they can't really be educated in the same way. So in terms of consent and access, you know, I think it just needs to be a universal right in some ways to be able to have access to these digital systems, and that education needs to be very fundamental. Just like you learn your ABCs, you should be taught in schools how to access these systems.
And just in terms of, you know, we talk in Women Identity about where the responsibility for that education lies, because it's kind of, you know, there's lots of different actors. If you think about, you know, the chain of opening a bank account, for example, you know, there's lots of different actors in terms of that chain. And, you know, one of the actors in that chain would be, in this instance, the biometric provider, the identity company. One of those actors in that chain will be, you know, the bank. And I guess my question is, and then, you know, if they don't manage to get onboarded into their bank, where do they go? To your point, Keren, I think you were saying, you know, we have to be building for the unhappy path as well as the happy path. You know, not everybody's going to be able to get through these systems. And we have to kind of go, actually, there is no silver bullet to this. We have to build for the unhappy path. Where do you, I mean, do either of you have a view as to where the responsibility lies, or do you think it's, you know, do you think it's like a shared responsibility? Who wants to go first on that one? Keren, what do you think? What, in terms of your
such a tricky questions. By the way, I'm noticing there just are fabulous questions in the chat box that I wish we could address all of them in this short time period. But I think the responsibility lies in you know, when it comes to issues, for example, of digital identification, we really do have to look at the wider ecosystem. And I think there are different bodies that are involved. Like when it comes to the problem of double registration, this issue that I discussed, by double registration, I'm referring in this case specifically to Kenyans who are stuck in legal limbo because they're citizens but can't access IDs, but because their biometrics are in the refugee database. I think in that case, it's the responsibility of a variety of different bodies, not just the UNHCR, also the Kenyan government. I also recognize that, you know, institutions like the UNHCR are often in very tricky positions because they have to navigate between the needs of host countries and funders who demand accountability. And so I think that responsibility is kind of, in most cases, is spread out across a variety of different bodies in most cases.
And I don't know, Debbie, if you've got a different view on that, and then I'm going to grab one of these questions that's in the chat box. Have you got a kind of view on that in terms of where the responsibility lies?
Yeah, I think people who are creating these systems, they need to work together. So with your example about someone creating a bank account, they need so many different levels of ID or information. So all these systems, they need to get together so that they can create less friction in this process. You know, because if someone, you know, anyone, for example, anyone going to a bank, creating a bank account, they'll need probably it's the same types of ID all across the board. So it was incumbent on the banks or whoever, you know, the government systems to be able to work together to create less friction, because we know that people need those things. Also, the education thing, I think, in my view, it falls on everybody. You know, everybody in anyone creating digital systems, anyone using digital systems. I don't know about you, but you know, I think every family has like some family member who's like tech support, you know, unpaid tech support, having to help your family members get through these issues. You know, I wish I had get paid for this. Like literally, I do this a ton of times, but I think it's everyone's responsibility, if you're able to do it, to really help educate people about how to have a pathway forward.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the tech support, so, and the biometrics thing. So my mother-in-law came to me one day, and she was like, oh, you know, my bank has implemented, it was a biometric methodology, I think it was facial recognition. And she came to me, and I thought she was going to say to me, she said to me, I'm not going to use it. And I was like, okay. And I thought she was going to say to me, I'm not going to use it because I don't trust it. So I was like, okay, well, I'm interested, you know, why aren't you going to use it? And she said, well, I don't think it's secure. So, I mean, I genuinely, she knows nothing about this kind of subject matter. And this is just it's just a good example of it. And I said, well, why, you know, what would you think is more secure if you don't think this is secure, facial recognition? And she said, well, I think iris recognition is more secure. Now, she's probably got that from the Minority Report, right? But I think that kind of shows the vacuum that we're talking about in terms of like people's understanding on where they're actually getting their information from about what systems that they can trust and what they shouldn't be trusting. You know, and so I think that's just one example, and that's, you know, that's not in a market, you know, that's here in the UK, where actually our bank probably had the opportunity to educate her, you know, and actually hasn't taken that opportunity. So she's gone away and said, I'm not going to use it because I don't think it's secure. So I think that just, you know, kind of typifies it. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I think we'll, because we're almost top of the hour. So we've got one, we've got one from Nishant here. So there are technical standards, then there are process standards. What Nishant's saying is, he says he sees a lack of process standards relating specifically to biometrics, ones that ensure proper testing, data protection, controls around scope creep and misuse and more. So the question is, have you seen anything in a form that addresses biometrics specifically and don't just default to generic data standards? Or do we not need anything specific to biometrics? So I think what he's saying is, do the data protection principles just deal with biometrics, and do we need anything else? What do you think, Debbie?
Well, I'm with him. I agree with that. I feel like there's a huge issue, and I've always felt this way about operations, you know. So once you have these standards, once you have this technology, how do you handle it in real time? How do you know, what is people's day-to-day tasks like? What are the things that they're doing that's contributing in a positive way to make sure that not only the users of this technology, but the people who support it and develop it have the things that they need to be able to move forward in the right way. So it's a big issue. It's a huge issue. I think, you know, just getting a standard, just getting the technology, just understanding the laws really doesn't go far enough to really resolve the problem.
Sure, and I think, you know, if we look at the examples that Keren's talked about in some of these African countries where there isn't there might not be, you know, I mean, about half the African countries have got privacy standards, yes, but some of them may not have, for example. So where there isn't a data privacy standards, we might just have a technical standard for biometrics, for example. So I guess, you know, Nishant's saying in that example, there is a vacuum because we don't even have a, you know, data privacy standard. I don't know if you've got any commentary to do with that at all, Keren, in your view.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what you're saying, I think data privacy and data protection acts are still very nascent. So even countries that have rolled them out, sometimes they're very new, sometimes they haven't they have yet to really be enforced. So yeah, it's a big issue.
Okay, cool. Right, so we are 2 minutes before the top of the hour. So I want to just take some time to thank you both so much, and the amazing, I mean, just I have to say, I've actually struggled to keep up with the chat because there's been
Yes.
that much stuff rolling into the chat, and I was in my mind, I was like, we're going to go into this, and then the chat and the questions will come up, and I'll just read them. But I've had to be doing my ultimate in multitasking, trying to get to all the questions. So, I mean, that just shows how important this topic is, and how we really, as an industry, we have to bring together lots of different viewpoints, and those are not just the viewpoints of technologists, they're the viewpoints of your background, Keren, is in kind of anthropology and history and understanding of users on the ground, but also privacy advocates like yourself, Debbie. We have to kind of all get around this issue, because just developing technical standards, it sounds like, even from what the audience is saying, this isn't going to address this topic in the way that we need to on a global scale. So just so the audience know where to find you, because I'm sure they want to know where you're going to be. Keren, where can we find you? Do you have are you on Twitter, LinkedIn? Where's the place for people to find you if they want to ask more?
I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also contact me by email. And I really, again, I do wish this was a bit longer, because I really appreciate the questions that are popping up in the chat box.
Cool. So what we will do is we will take these questions afterwards, and we will see if there's a way of us perhaps finding a way within the Women in Identity website to respond to some of these questions. And Debbie, where can we find you? Where can people find you if they want to have a chat to you and they're interested in your viewpoints after this session?
Well, I'm very active on LinkedIn, so anyone who wants to pop in on LinkedIn, send me a friend request, a connection request. Love to hear from you. You can contact me at my email, datadiva at debbiereynoldsconsulting.com, or my website, debbiereynoldsconsulting.com.
Cool, perfect. Thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to our audience for your participation. Hot topic, and yeah, all I can say to everyone is join you for the next one. We're also going to be sending out some feedback after this session, so please answer the feedback. So yeah, we've also got a number of events here, so please go to the Women in Identity website if you want to hear more about our events. And also, if you can answer to the feedback survey, which will be coming out to all of the people that have registered. Thank you so much, and go to our YouTube channel if you want to listen to this again. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.